Snow still clung to the edges of the sidewalk when my life turned upside down. I was on my knees on the cold kitchen floor, picking up the shattered pieces of a porcelain teacup. Not just any cup, but one of those imported from France, part of a set that cost more than my entire paycheck. That's when I heard her heels clicking across the marble, each step sounding like a sentence being handed down. Useless girl. That cup was worth more than everything you own. Mrs. Veronica Fairchild's voice was sharp as a blade. Tall, blonde, always draped in a fur coat, she was the epitome of Hartford, Connecticut's upper crust. And me? I was just the help, or as she loved to call me, that Southern girl who cleans up after high society. My name is Helena Grace Coleman, and today, at 77 years old, I can proudly say those days are long gone. But on that freezing January morning in 1964, I was just a 19-year-old girl with cracked hands from the cold and a heart worn thin from exhaustion. Veronica, wife of the well-known district attorney Dr. Charles Fairchild, had never treated me with an ounce of respect. From the moment I stepped into that mansion, with its tall windows and echoing hallways, she made it clear who was in charge and who was expected to keep her eyes down. But something shifted that day. As she shouted, breathless and putting on her usual theatrical display of rage, I caught Charles looking at me differently. He stood at the office doorway, watching silently, as if he was seeing past my slouched posture. His ice-blue eyes didn't speak, but they didn't look away either. Not this time. When she was done berating me, he finally muttered, "That's enough, Veronica." It was the first time anyone had stood up for me. And that was the moment my story began to shift, from silence to voice. That night, like every other, I slept in the back room. The sagging mattress and the window that wouldn't shut let in the biting wind, as if the house itself was whispering that I didn't belong. But unlike every other night, I didn't cry. I kept thinking about the way he looked at me. In that moment, I realized maybe, just maybe, someone had finally seen me. The next morning, something completely unexpected happened. Charles asked to see me in the garden. It was cold out, and he wore a gray coat that stood out against the lifeless winter landscape. "Helena," he said softly, "I need to ask you something. Are you all right? You seem worn down." It was like a dam broke. The words poured out before I could stop them. The insults, the unpaid overtime, the slashed wages, the names she called me when he wasn't around. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. When I was done, he pulled an envelope from his coat pocket and handed it to me. "She shouldn't treat you that way," he said quietly. "You didn't deserve any of it. This is what you should have been getting from the start." My hands trembled as I held the envelope. It wasn't just money. It was justice. It was the first crack in the invisible prison I'd been living in. If you've made it this far, I know this story has touched something in your heart. And if it has, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Small stories like mine can spark big changes, not just in the lives of those who listen, but in the hearts of those who dare to speak. That night, after our conversation in the garden, I could barely sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to the wind rattling the warped window and the creaking of the old wardrobe in the corner. I held the envelope so tightly my hands ached. It felt like the world had shifted, like something deep inside me had been stirred awake. A seed I didn't yet understand, but one that had started to grow. Charles Fairchild had seen me. Not with desire, not with pity, but with respect. And for someone like me, that felt almost sacred. The next morning, Veronica left early, like she did every Wednesday, for her riding lessons. The house was quieter than usual. I wandered the wide hallways with a dust cloth in hand, but my mind was elsewhere. As I passed the gold-framed mirror in the entryway, I caught my reflection. A young woman with her hair pulled back, her skin darkened by the southern sun, dressed in a wrinkled uniform that didn't belong in such a refined place. And yet, something had shifted. My gaze was steady. When I entered his office to clean, I hesitated. That room had always intimidated me. Floor-to-ceiling law books, dark furniture, and the lingering scent of leather and cigar smoke. But there it was on the desk, another folder, slightly open, revealing payment receipts. My name, the correct amount, far more than I had ever received. Confirmation. A chill ran through my body. It was real. Charles had been paying me fairly, and Veronica, she had been pocketing most of my wages all along. Inside me, a silent fury began to rise. My hands trembled as I carefully placed the papers back exactly as I'd found them. I left the office and walked straight to the backyard laundry room. And there, I cried, alone. But it wasn't just sorrow. It was indignation. It was years of buried pain turning into fire. That same night, something even more unexpected happened. Charles came home early from work. I saw his car pull into the driveway through the kitchen window. He never arrived before 8. Veronica was out, and for the first time, he stepped into the kitchen. "May I?" he asked gently, nodding toward the wooden chair by the sink. I nodded, too stunned to speak. "Helena, I read your note." My throat tightened. The note. Yes. I had left a small letter on top of the envelope he'd given me. Just a simple thank you, and a few lines explaining that everything I did was for my mother back in Arkansas, that every penny went toward her medicine, food, and school books for my younger brothers. He leaned back in the chair and sighed. "You know," he said, "you have more courage than anyone I know, more than many of my colleagues in court." Those words broke something in me. Tears came, this time without shame. I lowered my head, trying to hide it, but he stood up slowly and handed me a handkerchief. Soft, embroidered fabric. "You're not alone anymore." Words like that, spoken that way, carry a weight that seeps through the walls of your soul. For the first time, someone believed in me, not as a maid, but as a woman, as a human being. I didn't know it yet, but everything was starting to change. The following Tuesday, the atmosphere inside the mansion felt different. Heavier, somehow. Like something invisible was hanging in the air, ready to snap. Veronica had returned from her trip that day, adorned with even more jewelry and trailing a cloud of imported perfume that filled the hallways before she even appeared. She walked as if gliding over red carpets, completely detached from the world around her, until the world began to crumble beneath her perfectly polished heels. It was around 4 in the afternoon when it happened. I was in the kitchen, stirring a stew, the comforting aroma of garlic and onions sizzling in the pan filling the room with warmth, when I heard the front door slam open with unusual force. I rushed to the foyer, still holding the dishcloth, and saw the unthinkable. Charles standing in the entryway, rain dripping from his hair, shoulders tense, eyes cold as steel. And there, on the beige velvet couch, Veronica wasn't alone. She jumped up, tugging at the neckline of her blouse. Beside her, hastily slipping on his suit jacket, was Richard Moore, Charles's law partner. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one moved. For a moment, time itself seemed to freeze. "Richard, Veronica, how long have you two been making a fool of me?" Charles' voice was low, but it carried a frozen fury that filled the room. "Charles, it's not what it looks like," Veronica stammered, with a false tone of shock that wouldn't fool a child. "No? Because it looks exactly like what it is." His stare cut through them like a knife. Richard's face turned crimson. He mumbled something unintelligible and bolted for the door without looking back. Veronica tried to explain, tried to cry, tried to manipulate, but Charles wasn't buying any of it. For the first time, he looked at her with such controlled disgust it was painful to witness. I stood in the doorway of the breakfast room, unsure whether I should stay or retreat. And that's when Veronica noticed me. "This is all your fault, you meddling little hillbilly. I knew you were sticking your nose where it didn't belong," she spat, venom dripping from every word. Before I could respond, Charles stepped in. "Leave Helena out of this. What's happening here is your doing, and yours alone, Veronica." His words wrapped around me like a shield, protecting me from the woman who had done everything she could to erase my existence. In that noisy, tense moment, the house began to shift. Veronica stormed up the stairs, heels pounding, screaming about divorce, splitting assets, and scandal. Charles just stood there, exhaling deeply, eyes filled with weary disappointment. "I'm sorry you had to witness that, Helena," he said quietly. "You didn't create this mess, sir," I replied, my voice trembling despite my effort to stay composed. That night, the mansion was eerily silent. The portraits still hung in place, the chandeliers glowed, the polished furniture gleamed, but something essential had broken, and I knew deep down nothing would ever be the same again. Veronica left the next day like a storm disguised in pearls and fur. She dragged her luggage across the marble floors, shouted at the housemaids whose names she barely knew, and stormed past me with fire in her eyes, hurling insults under her breath like venom-tipped darts. "You'll regret this, Helena. You'll pay for every bit of it." I didn't move. I stood still holding the serving dish I had been carrying to the dining table. My fingers tightened around the warm ceramic, but my eyes met hers, steady, unflinching. For the first time, I didn't look away. I was no longer the scared girl who had arrived at that house with a patched-up suitcase and thin-soled shoes. Charles appeared in the kitchen the moment the front door slammed shut. He looked older, as if he'd aged 10 years overnight. The dark circles under his eyes and the crooked tie said everything. He hadn't slept. He leaned against the doorframe, looked at me for a long moment and said, his voice heavy with emotion, "She never should have spoken to you that way." "She always did, sir," I replied softly. "You just weren't around to hear it." The silence between us was thick, painful, but necessary. "Call me Charles," he said finally. "From now on, nothing's going to be like it was." He walked out of the kitchen slowly, leaving behind a trail of exhaustion and something else, freedom. For the first time, the mansion felt peaceful. No yelling, no barking orders, no angry footsteps echoing down the halls. Only the faint hum of the old radio in the breakfast nook and the scent of fresh bread I'd baked that morning. The smell of home, of simplicity. Things that never quite belonged in that house, until now. In the weeks that followed, I carried on with my work. I washed imported linen sheets as if they were my own. I polished the oak floors and pressed dresses I'd never afford to wear. But something in me had shifted. Charles began coming home earlier. Sometimes we'd cross paths in the hall. Other times, he'd show up in the kitchen just to ask if I needed anything. It wasn't seduction. It wasn't loneliness. It was a quiet kindness, like someone trying to rebuild a life after everything they knew had crumbled. In the third week after Veronica's departure, he handed me my paycheck in an envelope, along with a small, handwritten note. "Thank you for your work and for your loyalty. You've helped this house breathe again." I tucked away the envelope, full, fair, and folded the note like it was sacred. I bought myself a new blouse and a pale blue skirt. That Sunday, my day off, I went to church wearing those simple clothes that made me feel whole. I prayed like I never had before, not asking for anything, just giving thanks that I hadn't given up on myself. It was during this time of quiet, of gentle listening and unspoken trust, that a new kind of connection began to grow. We didn't know what we were building, but we knew it was no longer what we had been. If you've felt this transformation with me so far, tap the heart and subscribe. Your presence on this journey is a beautiful way of saying, I believe in new beginnings too. It was a spring Wednesday when everything truly began to change. Charles called me into his office, a room I'd only ever entered quietly, just to dust the dark wood furniture and straighten the rows of hardcover books. But this time, I wasn't there as the help. I was there as someone invited to sit. "Helena, you're probably wondering what's going to happen with your job," he said, slowly turning a pen between his fingers. The golden light of late afternoon streamed through the tall windows, casting a warm glow over the room. My heart quickened. I nodded silently, unable to form a single word. "Actually," he continued, "I have something entirely different in mind." Charles told me he was leaving the district attorney's office. After decades of fighting for causes that, in his words, mostly protected the already privileged, He had decided to open a legal aid center for underprivileged families in a working-class neighborhood of Springfield, Massachusetts. "I want you to come with me," he said. "I need someone I can trust, someone to help with scheduling, organizing, and most importantly, connecting with the people." "But Charles, I barely finished middle school. I don't know the first thing about the law." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. His blue eyes, softened now by genuine lines of age and care, met mine. "You have something no degree can teach. You listen with your heart. That's more than enough to start." My mind swirled between fear and hope. It felt like stepping off a cliff, praying there'd be water below. And there was. I said yes. 2 weeks later, I moved into a modest boarding house near the new office. Charles had rented a small red brick building. Inside, it smelled of fresh paint. The furniture was second-hand, the walls still drying, and at the front desk, I placed a single flower in a glass, just to add some life. The first days were a whirlwind. I mixed up appointment forms, forgot names, missed deadlines. But Charles was patient. He gently corrected my mistakes, lent me easy-to-read books, and explained legal terms like a father teaching his daughter. At night, I studied under the glow of a small lamp, filling notebooks with scribbles, questions, and notes. It was exhausting and wonderfully new. And then the people started coming. Widows with missing pension checks, undocumented immigrants desperate for help, single mothers served with eviction notices, people no one else seemed to see. But Charles welcomed them with coffee, kindness, and the same steady gaze he'd once offered me, one that saw past appearances. And something inside me began to bloom. One day, an elderly man collapsed in the waiting room. Charles was in a meeting. I reacted on instinct, helped him sit, loosened his tie, dampened a cloth, and held his hand until the color returned to his cheeks. When Charles stepped out and saw us, he simply smiled. "You were born for this, Helena." That night, lying in my new bed, I whispered to myself, me? The woman who once could barely write a full sentence? The girl who silently poured tea in someone else's mansion? I was becoming part of something that changed lives. Yes, I was. Time moved differently in that little red brick office. There were no ticking clocks pushing us forward, no high heels clattering down marble floors like in the mansion. People arrived with heavy eyes and left lighter, as if they had placed the weight of an entire lifetime into our hands and walked out with hope. And between case files and cups of coffee, between appointments and quiet moments, Charles and I began to learn how to simply be together. It wasn't the kind of connection written about in law books. It was made of shared silences, knowing glances, and good mornings that sounded more like warmth than routine. Something was growing between us, but it was so quiet, so delicate, that even I took a while to recognize it. Until one night, everything came into focus. It was raining, the kind of soft, persistent rain that always seems to fall when life is about to shift. We had stayed late, organizing documents from a complicated case. The scent of coffee had long faded, and the only sound was the soft tapping of rain against the windows. Charles offered to drive me back to the boarding house. In the car, we talked about the day, about a child who had smiled when her father won full custody, and then about me. "Have you ever thought about going back to school?" he asked. "I have," I said, eyes fixed on the window, embarrassed. "But I've always been afraid I'm not good enough." He pulled the car to a gentle stop in front of a quiet park, turned off the engine, and looked at me. "Helena, you are the most capable person I know." I went still. My heart didn't seem to know whether to beat or break. There was something in his gaze I'd never seen before, a quiet, trembling intensity. "I've fallen in love with you," he said. Just like that. No build-up, no hesitation. Those words didn't sound like they came from a former prosecutor, a serious man with a career built on reason and law. They came out like a boy sharing a long-held secret. Soft, raw, real. I feel the same," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "But I've been so afraid. of what people will say, of how it will look. I'm just—" "Don't say that," he interrupted gently. "You are not just anything. You're everything. You are my choice." That night, in the quiet rain and under the glow of dim streetlights, we shared our first kiss. A kiss with no urgency, no fear. A kiss full of promises and healing. From that moment on, everything changed. We started spending weekends together in quiet places. On Sundays, we walked through almost empty parks. He told me stories from his childhood. I told him about the farm where I grew up. We laughed, and little by little, we allowed ourselves to dream together. But not everyone smiled with us. When a few of his old colleagues found out about our relationship, the whispers began. The comments, the sideways looks. One day, a woman stepped into the office and recognized me from years ago. "Weren't you the maid in that big house in Hartford? What are you doing behind that desk?" "Working," I answered, lifting my chin, even as a knot rose in my throat. I cried that night, cried harder than I had in years. But Charles held me gently and said, "You belong here more than anyone, because you built this place with me." In April of 1966, a letter arrived that would change the course of our lives. It came from Arkansas, written in the shaky hand of my father. My mother, my sweet, selfless mother, was not doing well. Her diabetes, quiet and relentless, had worsened. She needed urgent medical care, maybe even surgery, the kind of care our family could never afford. I read the letter alone, sitting on the park bench across from our office. The wind rustled the leaves of an old tree overhead, and my fingers shook so much I could barely finish reading. Fear came back like a tide, not for me, but for her, for everything she had given up to raise me. I showed the letter to Charles that very evening. He didn't hesitate for even a moment. "We'll bring her here," he said. "She'll get proper care. I know an excellent specialist." A week later, my parents arrived in Springfield for the very first time. They came on an overnight bus with just one small suitcase between them and wide, overwhelmed eyes at the tall buildings and bustling streets. My mother looked fragile, pale skin, tired eyes. But when she saw me, she smiled like she'd been given her life back. Charles welcomed them like family. He took my mother to the hospital, paid for every test, attended every appointment. He cared for her as if she were something precious. And in that cold waiting room, while the doctor explained that surgery wouldn't be needed, just medication, proper care, and stability, my father turned to me and whispered, "This man truly loves you, daughter." I didn't answer with words. I just held his hand. And somehow, in that simple gesture, everything I'd ever wanted to say was spoken. My mother improved faster than anyone expected. Regulated meals, the right medicine, and constant affection made all the difference. And when my parents returned home, they didn't just take restored health with them. They took the comfort of knowing I was safe. I was cherished. Not long after, Charles asked me to dinner. But it wasn't just any dinner. It was our place. That quiet little park bench where everything had started. He was nervous, and it caught me off guard. The man who always seemed unshakable. "Helena," he said, "life's too short to pretend we don't know how we feel. Will you marry me?" He opened a small blue velvet box with a simple ring inside, but it sparkled more than any jewel I'd ever seen. Not because of its cost, but because of its meaning. "Yes, Charles, I will," I whispered. We planned a modest wedding with wildflowers and a tiny church in the heart of the city. My parents were there. So were my brothers. His guest list was short, but the ones who mattered, loyal clients, true friends, came. I saw approving smiles and judgmental ones. But I also saw something greater. Hope reflected in the eyes of those who believed in our love. At the reception, Charles surprised everyone with an announcement. From this day forward, our legal aid center will be called Hope House, in honor of the woman who taught me that dignity isn't something you're born with or by. It's something you build. In that moment, the applause felt like one big, collective embrace. I cried, yes, But they were clean tears, the kind you cry not out of pain, but because, for the first time, you're not invisible anymore. You're seen and you're loved. In the years that followed, our life blossomed like a well-tended garden, sometimes facing drought, sometimes storms, but always grounded in strong, steady roots. The birth of our first son, Caleb, in 1969 felt like planting a seed in soil already blessed by the grace of rebuilding. I remember the day I told Charles the news. I made his favorite dinner, creamy pasta the way only I knew how. When I told him, he dropped his fork, not out of shock, but from emotion. He stood up and wrapped me in his arms like he was holding our entire future. In that moment, there was no doubt. We were a family. We raised Caleb among legal textbooks and wooden toys. He learned to walk in the halls of the office. Our clients would line up just to hold him, sing to him, offer little candies. As he got older, he'd proudly say he wanted to be a people helper, just like Mom and Dad. Later came our twin daughters, Lily and Grace. The house filled with laughter, midnight cries, tiny footsteps, and joy. We bought a bigger home, one with a backyard, a swing hanging from an old oak tree, and a dog named Poe. It was the kind of life I never would have dared to dream. That night I cried alone in the servants' quarters. The office, now officially named Hope House, grew beyond what we ever imagined. It became a beacon in the region. Charles turned down lucrative offers from high-powered law firms, choosing instead to stay where he could make real change. And I, the woman who once didn't know how to type, became the office manager, an advisor, and eventually an author. Yes, an author. It was our daughter Grace who pushed me. Mom, your story needs to be told. And it was. We published a memoir titled From the Back Room to the Block, and hundreds of women wrote to me afterward saying that, after reading it, they asked for raises, left abusive marriages, went back to school. And then came the blow. Charles fell ill in 1988, cancer. The word struck like thunder on a clear day. He, the pillar, the warrior, began to fade. He didn't want aggressive treatment. He said, I want to stay lucid, to say goodbye, to teach, to leave things in order. And he did. Clear instructions, handwritten letters for each of our children, a trust fund to keep Hope House alive, and a letter for me. It said, Helena, you were the miracle God sent me, disguised as a housemaid. Everything I am was rebuilt through your eyes. Take care of our family, and never stop believing that true love transforms. Charles passed on a quiet morning, surrounded by love. His funeral brought together judges, factory workers, single mothers, and young people who had once sat across from us, hoping for a second chance. They all came. Because that's who he was, not just a fair man, but a deeply human one. I became a widow at 42. I raised our children, I ran the office, and I carried on. Because moving forward is also a way of honoring those we've lost. Now, at 77, when I walk through the shelves of Hope House and see my grandson organizing case files, I know it was all worth it. That stolen paycheck was the first stone. My silence was the staircase, and my love was the foundation. If you've stayed with this story until the end, know this. It isn't just mine. It's yours too. It belongs to every woman who's ever felt invisible, who stayed quiet for too long, but one day chose to begin again. If this touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Your presence here keeps alive the chain of stories that heal, transform, and inspire. Because in the end, it's not about where we start. It's about where we choose to bloom.